This is a major issue in Mayo. I'm very much welcome that you've come here today. I want to first state on the record that everyone I have spoken to, whether it be Mara or MPWS or whoever it might be, they point to someone else. And in many cases, they've pointed to the department. So it is good to have you here this afternoon. First of all, you've outlined that Mara have paused the live applications for mull currently. Can you outline why that has been paused and how long it will be paused until?
It has been paused, as I understand. Obviously, Mara are independent in their functions. They make the determinations according to their own independence. But as I understand it, they have prioritised the likes of offshore renewable energy applications, and they have progressed through them, and they're getting to other.
Right. So it's paused primarily due to a resource issue in Mara, as opposed to a regulatory or gaps within the system currently.
As I understand it, yes, but there were issues. I think. Well, obviously there are issues with the regulatory system that Mara have identified, I suppose, and the circular that the department issued. I'm
just conscious of time. Is it a regulatory issue that paused it, or is it resources within Mara, or both?
Well, it was a prioritisation piece, I think, in Mara in the first instance, and could potentially be regulatory now.
Right. How long will it be paused on to? Do you have any idea?
I don't have detail on that, no.
Okay. Next question here. The deadline is fast approaching in terms of 2028. What have you done as a department to ensure that that regulatory burden of registration and all of the financial costs are not placed with a very small seaweed harvester that might be taking a very small amount of seaweed? For example, a business that might have seaweed bats in Achill Island, for example. What are you doing to ensure that all that regulatory burden does not fall on a very small-scale seaweed harvester?
The onus on the harvester to register is with Táil Éireann, so that's a process that sits outside this department, and they would register there.
No, in fairness, I'm very frustrated with this idea of passing the buck to someone else. The 2028 deadline, there are fees to Mara. I think they're in the region of €2,000. There's very significant environmental fees and reports, etc., as well as Táil Éireann. Now, I have waited very long to try and get answers, and all of them have pointed to the department. So my question, you're a lead agency in relation to this. What are you doing to help seaweed harvesters that they're not faced with a massive cost in 2028?
So the circular the department issued last year essentially exempted the ordinary reasonable enjoyment of the foreshore, which means that a traditional.
Can you define the ordinary enjoyment? Because my understanding
Lawless,
is.
would you mind letting him finish the sentence? No, if you don't
Chair,
mind.
This is,
hang on.
Chair,
Deputy,
this is really important, Chair.
Deputy, I'm speaking. So if you wouldn't mind letting him finish the sentence, and then you can come back
Chair,
in. There's no issue. Please don't interrupt me. Yeah, I'm conscious of time and decorum here as well, and how this committee operates. So if you wouldn't mind letting the witness finish the sentence, and then you may come back in with your additional question.
Thank you. So the department issued the circular last year, which exempted ordinary reasonable enjoyment of the foreshore, which Mara have taken to apply to traditional harvesters. So they aren't required to go through the mull process. So they aren't required to get that licence from Mara.
Can you provide the definition of ordinary enjoyment? My question relates to how small a harvester must be in order to qualify as ordinary enjoyment.
So if it's being done on a non-commercial basis, or it's being used for their own domestic purposes.
What's the quantity?
There is no quantity, and we haven't.
So a person that might have a seaweed bath in Achill Island, who's running a very small business, a seasonal business, would they qualify as an ordinary enjoyment and therefore not need to apply for the mull licence?
If they have a traditional right, at present, if they have a traditional right to harvest that seaweed, then they qualify under that circular.
Even though they'd be using it technically for commercial purposes?
At present, the circular is what is determining Mara's interpretation, but I think what you're asking is certainly something, Deputy, that we're going to have to consider in the assessment piece, what the thresholds are for collection, what the ultimate use is for the collection of the seaweed, and what the various definitions then
Look, my point here, and I'm trying to be constructive, my point here is that this ordinary enjoyment, and I've heard you respond to it across the afternoon, is that is actually very limited, and it is very small when you look at the detail. So the vast majority of seaweed harvesters are actually not going to fall into that category. They may be harvesting a very small amount of seaweed and using it for commercial reasons, and that's the point. And that is really the fundamental issue I want to get across to you today as a department. That must be either expanded, or you as a department must reduce the threshold, the regulatory burden, and potentially look at a reduced fee structure for these very small-scale harvesters. Is that something you're willing to consider?
Certainly, we're looking at all options in the assessment process. So I suppose the process for smaller scale commercial activity as well is something that we will be looking at and we will consider.
Yeah, well, look, I very much welcome that, and I'm happy, and I'm happy that that is registered here in this committee. Two things I think you should consider is one, a reduced or a tiered structure in terms of fees, that for very small scale producers, because the vast majority won't fall under the ordinary enjoyment piece. And also, I think you should consider also the idea of a cooperative where farmers may be able to come together as a cooperative, whereby they wouldn't have to go through all of the onerous regulation, environmental assessment, fees, etc. as well. And I have held a public meeting on this issue in Newport. Hundreds of seaweed harvesters have come to that meeting, and many indeed have raised this. So I would ask you to consider both of those solutions, because currently what is on offer is not going to work for the vast majority. In fact, the regulatory system, as I see it currently, is for the large players. It is for the big multinational companies, and that must be said here. In terms of consultation, you've outlined that you're willing to engage in consultation.
You're just over time, so I'm going to
Can I finish the question, Chair?
Please. No, because the question will elicit a response. We'll be several minutes in. I'm going to go to Senator. I know it's all very important. We'll go to Senator Boyle, Deputy McLaughlin, then there'll be another opportunity to come back in, just to be fair to everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I've only one question here, and I'll be brief. If you look in the briefing note here, it says Donegal Seaweed identifies the key issues of the lack of transparency, communication within the industry, differing approach to harvesting, and the lack of harvesting framework. They are looking to establish a regional harvesting group to review. I'll be honest, I've had a couple of meetings too with seaweed harvesters and the seaweed companies in Donegal, and there is a willingness there to try and get this working. Like, one depends on the other. They really do. The factory's no good without the harvester, and the harvester's no good without the factory. So I think maybe, as the Deputy said there, things is maybe different in Galway and Mayo compared to Donegal. If there was a regional look taken at it to see what would work in Donegal compared to Mayo and Galway, and then come up with an overall package, I think that would be the way to go. Because no one talking to the harvesters and the seaweed companies in Donegal, they want the harvester to retain the individual rights that he has for 20, 30 years. And I think if we can relay that back, that these harvesters aren't going to be pushed out of the way for the bigger boys to come in and do what they want, I think we have a momentum then to move forward. I think it's lack of clarity at the moment. This really has people's back up. And I think the sooner you could come out with your report or get it out there and get people talking about it, it's the fear. It's really the fear of what's going on here that's causing the major problem. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Certainly the stakeholder engagement piece, would be happy to engage with industry and traditional harvesters, and I appreciate what you're saying in terms of communication, and that's certainly something we'll have to consider in our assessment, that communication piece, and make sure that clarity is brought to people in the industry.
Yeah. Thank you.
Senator Deputy McLaughlin. You're okay, Deputy Lawless.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to
It's 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Thank you. In relation to the consultation, I welcome the fact that you've outlined you're going to engage in consultation. I would ask you to travel the west coast of Mayo and indeed the coastal counties, hold public meetings and hear from ordinary families that have been doing this for generations. And I thank you. In relation to MARA's capacity to process particularly large-scale applications, I am concerned with their ability to do this, and particularly around the fact that the foreshore ownership and historical harvesting rights have not been fully mapped. There hasn't been, I believe, sufficient time for native seaweed harvesters to register those rights with Tailteann Éireann, etc. Are you concerned that MARA just doesn't have the ability to grant or even process these large-scale applications in light of so much ambiguity in terms of native seaweed harvesters' rights?
I'm not concerned at MARA's capacity. I know they've been going through a process, an efficiency process, to look at their processes to go through the MAC and Mull applications and increase delivery or increase throughput.
My question isn't necessarily about resources. My question is about the ambiguity in relation to the foreshore, that MARA actually does not have clear oversight in relation to what the existing rights are on the foreshore. So, for example, when a large-scale seaweed harvesting application comes in for potentially thousands of hectares of geographical area on the coastline, how does MARA process that if it doesn't know Joe Bloggs down the road has a traditional harvesting right?
Yeah. I think you're probably getting to one of the really important pieces here is that we do need to build the picture of who has those traditional rights right around the coast. And I think there's a piece of work there, and that's, I think, part of the work we'll be doing as well, is to make sure we can build that picture. I think that's you have to know what's out there. I wouldn't be concerned. I think MARA certainly have the capacity to as through a licensing application, for example, there's public consultation and there's ways of ensuring that the information is out there. But I think what you're speaking to is exactly the concern that has been raised about there is and that's why we have undertaken this kind of regulatory kind of re-examination effectively, is to ensure that those who hold traditional rights, and I suppose I want to reassure people who are tuning in and watching, is that from the policy perspective, we're absolutely clear that if people hold rights to harvest seaweed, there is obviously an obligation that they can register those rights, but we want to ensure that that map and that picture is fully understood, so it is really clear if somebody is to come in and apply for a bigger licence, whether they can or they can't, or if a traditional right.
And do you accept that is a difficult task currently?
Absolutely.
Given
it's why we're here. It's why we're examining this very complex
and given how serious a situation it would be whereby a licence was granted over effectively another family who've had it for generations, given the context and the significant issue that would pose, should large-scale applications not be paused until such time as the MARA has full oversight and transparency in relation to foreshore ownership?
I think what we're trying to do is build that regulatory certainty, so to absolutely avoid the prospect of that happening. I think there are probably safeguards in the system already to prevent that, but what we do need to do is maybe make the system a little bit more robust and make that clearer. And I think that's
Can I ask how is that happening? What is undertaken currently in the department to make sure that MARA has the ability then to process these applicants?
So we have a piece of work underway which will include a lot of consultation with exactly the people you have spoken about how we effectively design an appropriate, proportionate and fit for purpose regulatory system that deals with traditional harvesting rights. So at the moment
What's the timeline?
I don't have the timeline. We spoke about that earlier. We're working hard, I suppose, to develop that, and we'll consult and work on.
And can I ask you then, from a department perspective, would it not be wise and prudent then to issue a notice to MARA to say hold off on accepting or processing any large-scale applications until we as a department address the regulatory gaps?
I think things can go hand in hand. I think Mara make their own decisions in terms of a licensing system that's up and running. Mara I think they've made their own adjudications in terms of where they sit in that space. And I know they've been in front of this committee. Our job is to get the policy and the legislative framework correct.
But also, surely your job is to make sure that Mara have the ability to do their job. And clearly, one huge impediment of Mara being able to process and grant licences is their inability to determine what is happening on the ground, who owns foreshore licences, what native seaweed harvesters exist. That's an obvious issue that presents Mara.
And I think they're working very hard to ensure that they build that picture and they understand who exactly might be impacted through a licence or an application process. So I think that's exactly the work that's ongoing, Deputy.
The point I'm making, with respect, is that
you're over time, so I'll allow
the lack of
consultation
is actually, with native seaweed harvesters, is actually preventing the whole process, a streamlining of a process. And the fact that it's so difficult for seaweed harvesters to register, etc., the fact that the department have not engaged, have not assisted those people, has actually left a significant amount of ambiguity in the entire system.
Thanks,
so
Deputy.
I believe that it's important that the department actually address these issues first before we can actually proceed.
I've given you plenty of leeway.
Thank you,
now.
Chair. Thank you.
So you've put your question. We'll allow a response and we're done.
Thank you,
okay?
Chair. Thank you.
So the obligation is to register, as I said, with Tailteann Éireann. The department, as part of our assessment process, is going to engage with the industry itself, with the stakeholders, with the harvesters, to see what their views and perspectives are, and take it into consideration as we develop this regulatory system. But as I say, I suppose the information gap is between what's registered with Tailteann Éireann and what Mara have access to, and that's a gap that we have to close, because the information doesn't sit with Mara, so we need to close that gap so that they can take it into consideration when they are looking at the licence applications.
Yeah, the 2028 deadline is coming.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
You've put your question. You're well over time.
Thank you, Chair.